Welcome. I am here to tell you a story you think you already know, the one about knights and dragons. You picture vast wings against a sunset, a hoard of glittering gold in a mountain cave, a noble beast challenged by a hero in shining armor. These are comforting fables, lullabies sung to a species that needs to believe it has conquered the world. But the truth is not a story. It is a scar, a deeply suppressed genetic memory from a time when our ancestors were not masters, but vermin. They scurried in the shadows of living mountains, and their terror was so absolute that it etched itself into our very DNA. Dragons were never magical. They were biological, the planet's original and undisputed apex predators. And they did not go extinct. They merely went to sleep. And we have been living on their tomb for 1,000,000 years. In this forgotten world, we find Dr. Eris Thorne, a man whose formidable intellect was eclipsed only by his monumental pride. Ostracized by the paleontological community, his theories on endoterrestrial ecosystems were the laughingstock of every major university. He spoke of life on a geological scale, of organisms that were not merely in the earth, but were the earth. This privately funded drilling operation in the heart of Siberia was his last desperate gamble to prove them all wrong. Every condescending dismissal from his peers was fuel for his obsession, every cynical smirk a reason to drill deeper. His entire identity was a fortress built on the unshakable foundation of rationalism, a belief that anything, no matter how vast or terrifying, could be observed, categorized, and understood by the human mind. The research outpost was a lonely steel blister on an infinite expanse of white. Outside, the Siberian wind howled a song of utter indifference, a sound so vast and empty it seemed to be the voice of oblivion itself. The cold was a physical predator, seeping through every seal and threatening to leach the warmth from blood and bone. Inside, the recycled air was a stale cocktail of machine oil, stale coffee, and human sweat, a fragile bubble of life adrift in a sea of primordial silence. The only constant sound was the deep, resonant groan of the drill shaft, a monotonous prayer boring its way into the planet's core. This was a place at the very edge of existence, where help was a concept as distant and abstract as the stars. Then the anomaly began. It was not the chaotic shudder of shifting tectonic plates, but something else, something disturbingly organized, a rhythm. Deep beneath the permafrost, the sensors picked up a slow, deliberate pulse, a sub-audible thrum that resonated not in the ears, but in the fillings of their teeth, in the marrow of their bones. Thump, thump, thump. It was a beat that defied all known geology, a pattern that the instruments, screaming with alarms, identified as being consistent with massive, vascularized tissue. The crew saw a monster in the data, a reason to flee. Thorne, however, saw only the beautiful, terrifying symmetry of his life's work made real. He saw vindication, and he silenced their growing panic with the cold, unyielding steel of his certainty. "Push through!" he ordered, his voice a blade cutting through the thick tension in the control room. The drill, forced beyond every safety protocol, shrieked a final metallic scream as it bit into something impossibly resilient. Then, with a sickening lurch, it gave way. A profound silence fell, a void so complete it felt like the world holding its breath. It was broken by a low hiss rising from the borehole, the sound of a lung emptying itself after an eon of stillness. The air that vented into the outpost was warm, and it carried a scent that logic could not process, the cloying sweetness of decay, the coppery tang of ancient blood, and the unmistakable odor of a crypt being opened for the first time since the dawn of humankind. He had not found an ecosystem. He had found a god, and he had just pounded on its chamber door. Thorne's initial triumph was a fleeting, toxic thing, a fever dream in the face of a dawning reality. While he saw the culmination of his life's work in the data streams, his crew saw only the abyss. The air from the breach was heavy, clinging to the back of the throat and making each breath a conscious effort. It was thick with the planet's ancient secrets, and it began to poison the sterile environment of the control room with a primal dread. The rhythmic, subterranean pulse grew stronger, no longer a faint tremor felt through machinery, but a tangible vibration that hummed up through the soles of their boots. It was the sound of a coffin lid being unsealed from the inside, and every soul in that room, save for one, knew that they should never have knocked. He deployed the camera drone with the steady hands of a surgeon, his voice a calm, clinical narrator over the comms as the small machine began its descent. It was a marvel of human engineering, a sterile insect of titanium and fiber optics, equipped with a dozen different sensors to taste, smell, and see the unknown. For Thorne, it was his emissary, his detached eye, that would bring back objective, irrefutable proof of his theories. He watched the altitude numbers drop on the monitor, a grim smile playing on his lips as the drone sank deeper into the warm, waiting darkness. Down it went, a fragile beacon of human reason plunging into a place where reason had never before drawn breath, leaving the world of sunlight and sanity far, far behind. The first images that filtered back were impossible. This was no geological cavern carved by water or time. The drone's powerful lamps illuminated a landscape that defied every known science. The walls were not rock, but a vast curving expanse of what could only be described as keratinous hide, like the inside of a colossal shell. It was a sickening, mottled purple-gray, and it wept a thick, phosphorescent fluid that trickled down in slow, glowing rivulets. The texture was fibrous, muscular, and seemed to subtly shift and crawl under the drone's light. Thorne's narration faltered, the scientific terms dying in his throat as he tried to categorize a biological structure that was larger than the very concept of a single organism. Then the drone's camera panned, and the scientific impossibility curdled into visceral horror. There, against the weeping wall, was Ivanov, the expedition's lead geologist, who had wandered off hours before. He was not dead, not injured, not screaming. He was simply standing, his back pressed against the glistening tissue, his head tilted as if listening to a secret. The drone moved closer, the image sharpening, and the crew watched in frozen silence as the true nature of the scene unfolded. The wall was consuming him. His parka, his flesh, his very bones were dissolving, flowing into the hide like a watercolor painting left in the rain. There was no violence, no struggle, just a quiet, horrifyingly peaceful biological absorption. He was becoming one with the flesh of the world. The video feed dissolved into a blizzard of static, accompanied by a high-pitched electronic scream, and then silence. The main monitor went black, but the image of Ivanov's serene dissolution was seared onto the inside of every crew member's eyelids. The silence in the control room was absolute, a perfect vacuum where screams and prayers went to die. Thorne stared at the blank screen, his mind a frantic engine trying to assemble a rational explanation. Hallucinogenic gases, a cascading equipment failure, a trick of light and shadow. but the warm, sweet smell of rot billowing from the open borehole was undeniable, a physical testament to the atrocity they had just witnessed. The terror was no longer a theory. It was in the air they breathed. The world then answered their transgression with a single, convulsive shrug. It was not the familiar shudder of an earthquake. It was a focused, muscular spasm from deep below. The entire outpost bucked upwards, metal screaming as support beams twisted into grotesque shapes. Lights exploded in showers of sparks, plunging the station into a cacophony of panicked shouts and absolute darkness. The roar of the collapsing borehole was the loudest sound Thorne had ever heard, a deafening finality of 1,000,000 tons of rock and permafrost shearing away and sealing their tomb. It was the sound of a door being slammed shut and locked from the outside for all eternity. When the emergency lights flickered on, their weak, blood-red glow painted a scene of pure pandemonium. They were trapped, sealed miles beneath the Siberian tundra in a bubble of failing technology. The air was already growing thick, the pressure building in their ears, a constant reminder of the impossible weight of the world above them. The initial shock gave way to a raw, primal panic that no amount of training or authority could suppress. One crewman began clawing at a steel wall, his fingernails scraping uselessly against the cold metal, his sobs echoing the utter hopelessness that had descended upon them all. Thorne's commands for order were lost in the rising tide of animal fear, and then a sliver of false hope, more cruel than any despair. A junior engineer, sweeping the perimeter of the main cavern with a flashlight, shouted in discovery. Part of the wall had sloughed away during the tremor, revealing the entrance to a network of smaller tunnels. They were smooth and uniform, almost looking man-made, branching off into the darkness, away from the collapse. A way out, a path to bypass the blockage. The idea, insane as it was, ignited a desperate fire in the survivors' hearts. For a moment, the terror receded, replaced by the frantic energy of survival. Thorne, seizing the chance to restore his shattered authority, began barking orders, organizing an exploratory team to map this potential escape route. The fragile optimism began to unravel the moment they stepped into the first tunnel. The air within was different, warm, humid, and carrying a heavy metallic scent like a slaughterhouse. The ground was soft and yielding under their boots, and the walls were not cold stone, but felt strangely warm and pliable to the touch. The beam of their flashlights revealed that the tunnel walls were not just smooth. They were striated with what looked like massive dormant muscle fibers. A faint, rhythmic pulse seemed to emanate from the very structure around them, a slow, steady beat that synchronized perfectly with the colossal heartbeat they could still feel through the floor. The hope began to feel sickeningly misplaced. It was Lena, the team's pragmatic structural engineer, who voiced the impossible truth. She placed her palm flat against the wall, her eyes closing as she concentrated. "Feel that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's a pulse, a vascular rhythm." She swept her flashlight beam across the ceiling, pointing to where smaller tunnels branched off from the main artery in a perfect fractal pattern. "This isn't a cave system, Eris," she said, her voice cracking. "These aren't tunnels. We're in its veins." Thorne's mind fought the concept, his entire worldview rebelling against the monstrous biological logic of her words, but the evidence was all around them, in the air, under their feet, pulsing in the walls. As if summoned by their realization, a deep, wet, peristaltic sound echoed from the cavern they had just left. The entrance to the tunnel began to contract, the warm, fleshy walls closing in on themselves with the slow, inexorable certainty of a sphincter muscle. The opening shrank from a doorway to a porthole, to a pinprick of light, and then was gone. They were cut off, sealed within the circulatory system of the very thing they had disturbed. The final crushing understanding fell upon them. They were not explorers trapped in a cave. They were a foreign contaminant, a virus injected into the bloodstream of a living planet, and the body's immune system was beginning to take notice. The murder of their hope was a swift and brutal affair, leaving a vacuum that was quickly filled by a cold, leaden certainty of their doom. There would be no rescue. There was no escape. There was only the slow, rhythmic pulse of the creature's life, a sound that was now all around them, emanating from the very walls of their prison. It was the heartbeat of their own living coffin. The darkness in the veins of this entity was absolute, broken only by the increasingly frail beams of their flashlights. They were parasites, lost in the body of a god they had woken, and their presence was an irritation that would soon be purged. The very atmosphere was a weapon against them now. It was thick with airborne mutagens and psychoactive spores, a biological cocktail designed to disorient and incapacitate. Breathing felt like a chore, each inhalation drawing in a foreign biology that went to work on their own. Their thoughts grew sluggish, clouded with a strange lethargy, while the worm's subaudible drone worked directly on their minds. It was a constant gnawing pressure behind the eyes, a frequency that systematically dismantled higher brain function, stripping away empathy and reason, and leaving only the raw, twitching nerves of the lizard brain exposed. The descent into madness had begun. The first to break was Ben, the youngest member of the crew, a data technician no older than 20. He simply sat down in the middle of a vast artery-like chamber, refusing to go any further. He began to weep, a high, thin, keening sound that scraped at the sanity of the others. He babbled about the walls, claiming they were whispering to him in the dark, showing him images in the patterns of the phosphorescent slime. He spoke of vast empty spaces between the stars, and of immense sleeping things that dreamt of devouring whole suns. He was the canary in the coal mine, the first to succumb to the crushing psychic weight of the terror worm. Suspicion, sharp and ugly, began to fester among the survivors. With their rations dwindling, every hoarded protein bar and every sip of water became an act of profound betrayal. A dropped flashlight was no longer an accident, but a deliberate act of sabotage. Thorne tried to maintain the illusion of a chain of command, but his words were hollow echoes in the pulsing veins. He was just another frightened animal, his authority a forgotten concept from a world that no longer existed. Their small tribe was dissolving, their shared humanity evaporating under the relentless pressure of their environment, replaced by the primal territorialism of cornered beasts. Their own biology began to betray them. Strange, weeping rashes appeared on their arms and necks, secreting a fluid that glowed with the same faint, sickly luminescence as the walls of the tunnel. Their eyes became permanently bloodshot, the sclera threaded with angry red lines. A new kind of hunger began to gnaw at them, a deep cellular craving that their dwindling rations could not satisfy. It was a hunger for something vital, something raw, a desire that flickered in their eyes when they looked at one another, a disturbing new variable in their grim survival equation. Their bodies were being terraformed from the inside out. Thorne fought back with the only weapon he had left, his intellect. He clung to the scientific method like a prayer, a desperate ritual against the encroaching madness. He attempted to take samples of the air, to analyze the glowing slime on the walls, but his hand shook so violently that he could barely operate the equipment. He made entries in his digital logbook, his once neat, precise script degrading into a frantic, barely legible scrawl of observations and panicked hypotheses. He was no longer a scientist charting a discovery. He was a madman meticulously documenting the complete and utter death of reason. Starting with his own, deeper within the vascular labyrinth, they found they were not alone. Scuttling from a capillary tunnel was a thing that should not exist, a grotesque amalgam of familiar and alien biology. It had the basic shape of a Siberian mole, but its hide was a patchwork of chitinous plates and raw exposed muscle, and its claws were shards of razor-sharp obsidian. It moved with a silent, unnatural fluidity, its multiple black eyes tracking their every move with cold, detached intelligence. It did not attack. It merely observed, a silent shepherd guiding its flock deeper into the slaughterhouse, an antibody given form, a warden in the god's prison. The inevitable explosion of violence was both pathetic and horrifying. Two of the remaining engineers, their minds eroded to little more than primal instinct, began fighting over the last full water canister. There were no words, only guttural snarls and the sickening thud of fists on flesh. The struggle was short and savage, ending when one man grabbed a heavy fossil-bearing rock sample and brought it down on the other's skull. The victor, panting heavily, did not even glance at the body of his former colleague. He simply took the canister, drank deeply, and stared into the darkness with the vacant eyes of a creature that had forgotten its own name. He began to notice the changes in Dr. Anya Sharma, his most trusted colleague and the expedition's chief xenobotanist. Once a bastion of sharp wit and relentless optimism, she had grown silent, withdrawn. She stopped speaking in coherent sentences, instead humming a low, monotonous tune, a disquieting melody that perfectly matched the worm's rhythmic pulse. She took to collecting debris, shards of broken equipment, loose rocks, the personal effects of the dead, and would spend hours arranging them into complex, spiraling patterns on the tunnel floor, her lips moving in a silent, urgent conversation with the oppressive darkness around her. Thorne found her in a small spherical chamber that pulsed with a particularly strong red light, like a ventricle of the great heart itself. She had built a shrine in its center. She had placed the polished skull of the man murdered for water, and had adorned its empty sockets with clumps of the glowing phosphorescent moss. Anya was on her knees before it, her body swaying in time with the deep hum of the chamber. She was whispering to the skull, but the sounds that emerged from her throat were not human. They were a horrifying symphony of wet, guttural clicks and deep, resonant vibrations that sounded less like a language and more like an echo of the worm itself. He took a step towards her, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Anya?" He tried to reach for the brilliant scientist he had admired for years, the friend he had shared coffee with under the midnight sun. He needed to pull her back from this precipice of absolute madness. She turned her head slowly, and the woman he knew was gone. Her eyes, no longer brown and full of life, glowed with the same sickly, phosphorescent green as the slime on the walls. She was a vessel, a puppet, animated by the creature's will. A low hiss escaped her lips, a sound of pure, venomous territoriality, and she lunged at him, a sharpened shard of shale clutched in her hand. The ensuing struggle was a clumsy, desperate, and utterly degrading affair. All thoughts of science, of reason, of friendship were burned away by a flood of pure adrenaline. This was not a man trying to save his colleague. It was a cornered animal, fighting for its life against a predator in a subterranean burrow. He scrambled backwards, his hands searching frantically for a weapon, his fingers closing around the cold, heavy steel of a geological core sampler. He didn't think. He didn't reason. He simply reacted to the glowing eyes and the raised weapon, swinging the heavy tool in a wide, desperate arc. The sound of the impact was a sickeningly wet crunch, a sound that would haunt his waking and sleeping moments for the rest of his life. Anya dropped without a sound, the green light in her eyes extinguishing instantly. The silence that rushed back into the chamber was more profound and more terrifying than any scream had been. Thorn stood panting above her broken form, the core sampler held limply in his hand, dripping a dark fluid onto the pulsating floor. He looked at his hands, caked in blood and gore, and saw that they were no longer the precise, careful hands of a scientist. They were the crude, brutal hands of a murderer. In that moment of ultimate transgression, something within him broke forever. The man known as Eris Thorn died in that fleshy chamber, bludgeoned to death along with his last friend. He had shed the final tattered remnants of his civilization, his morality, his very humanity, and had become the savage animal that this primordial environment demanded. He had survived, but he was no longer himself. He was now just a creature of the deep earth, a thing of instinct and violence, perfectly adapted to the waking nightmare he had unleashed upon himself and his world. And as the ghost of his former self fled, a new and terrible awareness took its place. With his mind stripped clean of the complex clutter of reason and ethics, the constant psychic pressure from the worm no longer felt like an assault. It felt familiar. It was no longer a cacophony of madness, but a chorus of coherent thought, a broadcast he was suddenly tuned to. He was no longer an intruder to be purged from the system. By embracing the primal violence at the heart of this place, he had, in some unforgivable way, synchronized his own consciousness with the living world around him. He could almost understand the whispers now. The whispers were a map. In the hollowed-out ruin of his mind, the psychic static of the worm resolved into something like a blueprint of its own body. Thorn, no longer a man but an extension of the creature's will, began to move with a chilling, newfound purpose. He could feel the flow of bioenergy through the artery-like tunnels, sensed the distant thrum of major organs, and was guided by an instinct that was not his own. The human concept of escape had been purged from his thoughts. His new primal mind was now governed by a single, overwhelming imperative: to locate the source of the noise, the central consciousness, and to make it stop. He understood now where he was being drawn. The psychic currents were all flowing back towards the initial breach point, the site of his original sin. A cold, terrifying logic bloomed in the wasteland of his sanity. His drilling rig, the very instrument of his hubris, was still lodged in the creature's flesh, its massive drill head positioned directly above the central nerve ganglion, the worm's brain or its heart, or both. The tool he had used to pry open the tomb could now be the hammer that sealed it forever. A plan, born not of hope, but of pure nihilistic desperation, began to take shape. His journey back was a pilgrimage through a gallery of his own failures. He moved through the pulsing veins of the World Eater with the silent tread of a ghost. The grotesque antibody creatures, amalgams of flesh and rock, watched him pass from the shadows of capillary tunnels, their alien eyes showing not aggression, but a strange, unnerving recognition. He stepped over the mangled corpses of his crewmates, seeing them not as the friends and colleagues he had led to their doom, but as little more than discarded biological refuse. He was a phantom haunting his own crime scene, a wraith driven by a single sacrilegious purpose: deicide. He finally arrived in the central chamber, a cavern so vast it defied all sense of scale. It was a cathedral of living, breathing flesh, and suspended from its vaulted ceiling was the drill head, a shard of human technology piercing the heart of a primordial god. Directly below it, embedded in the floor, was the ganglion, a colossal pulsating organ of translucent nerve tissue and bioluminescent nodes. It bathed the entire chamber in a sickly, ethereal glow, and the heartbeat was no longer a sound or a vibration, but a relentless physical blow against his entire body, threatening to rupture him from the inside out. The final ascent was a climb towards his own damnation. He began to scale the colossal drill shaft, his hands and feet finding purchase on the cold steel, now slick with the creature's viscous organic fluids. It was a desperate, agonizing climb, a lone, broken man ascending the spear he had thrust into the side of the world. With every foot he gained, the worm's psychic presence intensified, the whispers of madness becoming a deafening chorus of 1 billion alien voices screaming directly into the core of his being, threatening to tear his consciousness apart and scatter it like dust. He clawed his way into the shattered remains of the drill head's control cabin, a phantom returning to his own machine. Through cracked monitors, he could see that the drill's compact nuclear core was still active, a contained star of human power humming quietly in the belly of the beast. The controls for a catastrophic overload were right there, a simple sequence of commands that would turn his monument to discovery into a bomb of unimaginable power. He knew what he had to do. He had to kill the god he had found, even if it meant becoming the devil to do so. But as his trembling fingers hovered over the console, the psychic assault changed. It was no longer a passive field of madness, but a direct, focused, and intelligent contact. The worm, the ancient slumbering mind of the planet, was now truly, finally aware of him, not as a generic infection, but as a singular, imminent threat. The billion screaming voices in his head fell silent, replaced by a single, impossibly ancient consciousness that pressed into his own, a mind as vast and cold as the space between galaxies, and it knew his name. The worm did not attack his mind. It opened its own. In that terrible instant of contact, Thorn was deluged with an eternity of memories that were not his. He saw the birth of the earth, a churning ball of fire and rock, and watched as colossal, slow-moving life took root in its molten heart. He felt the long, dreamless slumber that lasted for geologic ages, the slow shifting of continents, a gentle blanket over his skin. And in that slumber, he felt the echoing heartbeats of his siblings, sleeping soundly in the crushing blackness of the world's deepest trenches and dreaming patiently beneath the foundations of its tallest mountains. This was the worm's final, most devastating weapon, not a psychic attack, but the curse of absolute, unbearable truth. Thorn saw the entire history of humanity from a god's eye view, a brief, noisy, and utterly insignificant flash of bacteria flaring up on the planet's surface. He understood, with a certainty that shattered every last fragment of his soul, that killing this one creature meant nothing. It was like destroying a single cell in a body that spanned the globe. Humanity's extinction was not a possibility to be feared. It was a geological inevitability, a footnote in a history he was now forced to remember. Screaming, weeping, and laughing all at once, a man utterly broken by a truth too vast for any human mind to bear, he slammed his burned hand down on the overload console. The emergency alarms shrieked to life, a final, futile, human sound in the heart of the Leviathan. The countdown began, a human measure of seconds for an event that would undo an eon of silence. He had judged a god, and in doing so had passed sentence upon himself and the entire future of his species. He had won, and he had lost everything. The nuclear core went critical. A silent, blossoming flower of pure white energy incinerated the ganglion, and the chain reaction began. The creature's own bionuclear processes, deprived of their control center, ignited in a catastrophic, cascading meltdown. The death throe of the Terra worm was not a sound, but an event on a planetary scale. The ground for 1,000 miles bucked and heaved as the entity's dying nerves fired in a final, world-shaking spasm. The age of myth was ending in a blaze of atomic fire deep beneath the earth. The colossal surge of energy had nowhere to go but up. It blasted through the borehole, turning the deep wound Thorn had drilled into the throat of a new and furious volcano. A pillar of superheated rock, magma, and vaporized primordial flesh erupted into the frozen Siberian sky, blotting out the sun. Thorn, still inside the drill head, was caught in the volcanic blast. A broken puppet fired from a cannon of his own making, a speck of human debris hurled back into a world he no longer recognized. He was a messenger, returning from a war no one knew was being fought. He landed in a crumpled, broken heap miles from the blast, a smoldering, half-melted thing on the sterile white of the tundra. He was the sole survivor. Where his multi-million-dollar research outpost had once stood, a new mountain now smoked against the gray sky, a black, glassy monument of obsidian and cooled magma that entombed the corpse of the dead god. He had done the impossible. He had faced the dragon in its lair and slain it, and in the profound, absolute silence that now filled his mind, he felt a terror deeper than any he had known in the creature's presence. They found him 3 days later, a search party tracking the source of the unprecedented seismic event. He was babbling, his skin a patchwork of horrific burns, his eyes fixed on something they could not see. He spoke of sleeping mountains and dreaming oceans, of a world that belonged to ancient, slumbering things that saw humanity as a fleeting fever dream. To his rescuers, he was simply a man shattered by unimaginable trauma and isolation, the tragic lone survivor of a catastrophic geothermal accident. His frantic warnings were recorded as the meaningless ravings of a mind that had irrevocably broken. And so he lives, if you can call it that, a prophet in a padded room, cursed to live out his days with the perfect, crystalline knowledge of humanity's true place in the cosmos, a transient infection on a planet that is not and has never been ours. He is the man who killed a god and, in doing so, learned that there are countless more. The dragon he fought is dead, its tomb now a mountain on a map, but in the deep, silent and forgotten places of the world, its brothers and sisters continue their patient slumber, and they are beginning to stir. Now you know.